Right. Well, great to have all of you here. Welcome. Hope everyone's healthy and safe and your loved ones are healthy and safe. I'm Riyad Shahjahan. I'm a faculty member here at Michigan State University. I've always enjoyed being part of these talks and listening to these talks, and along with my colleague who will introduce herself. We're very happy and excited that you're here. We're going to present on something that's a work in progress. Would love to hear your feedback and comments. And please note that, we will try, I'm not sure if we can go through the chat at the same time as we're doing our presentation. So if you could leave your questions in chat for later. Unless, of course, there's something that's really urgent to share, then please do so. Like, for instance, you can't hear us or something like that. But other than that, yeah, we'll just do the presentation and we'll open up our Q&A. All right, Kirsten's yours.
Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm Kirsten Edwards. I'm a faculty member at the University of Oklahoma. And I think Riyad provided all the other necessary information. So I'm just happy to be here and happy to be in conversation. This project is a work in progress, so we appreciate any insight or any questions to help us think through the ideas more substantively. So thank you.
Okay, so our talk is really entitled Whiteness, Futurity, and Globalization of Higher Education. And many of you are probably already familiar with a lot of the globalization of higher education literature, and often they tend to be focused on what I would call six phases of globalization. One is the whole notion of technological changes. The other is the whole notion of increased mobility. Sorry, I'm having a hard time reading my own slides because I'm not used to it. It's blocking my. Wait, just give me, yeah. Okay, now I can see my slides. Sorry about that. Increased mobility. Then the third is the political economy, i.e. the role of the global knowledge economy. Another big area, which has been mostly my area of work around globalization of higher education, has been transnational actors, such as the role of international organizations like the OECD, World Bank, and increasingly now global university rankers. Many of you who are in this critical internationalization network are very familiar with this whole debate about internationalization of curricula, students, things around those kinds of areas. And then, of course, international partnerships. Those are usually tend to be the faces that we tend to talk about when we're addressing the notion of globalization of higher education. Okay, so within this literature, it's been interesting. I mean, this has been going on for about past 2 decades. As both Kirsten and I look at this literature, there's very little mention of race or racial analysis. There's been done work by Jill Blackmore on gender and other areas, but the notion of race in the question of globalization of higher ed has not received as much attention. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean race analysis has not taken place in the context of internationalization. And here, particularly, I want to draw attention to the work of Jenny Lee and others who looked at the question of neo-racism in the context of US, UK, South Africa, as well as South Korea. And there are others who've looked at questions of race around internationalization of higher education in terms of international students and so forth. But in terms of the notion of globalization as a process through which the global is formed, the notion of race has been very much absent. And this is concerning given what, first of all, with the whole notion of Black Lives Matter that's become a transnational movement, but also the decolonizing movements that have taken place around the world, particularly with student movements in the global south that has now moved around rest, as well as now what we see in terms of ethno-racialism that's going on around the world, particularly around COVID, but in other areas such as India with the Hindutva movement and all these things. So we are trying to, in many ways, bring the question of race into the forefront as we're thinking about globalization as a heuristic that has often been interrogated with other heuristics such as McDonaldization, such as issues around neoliberalism, such as cultural imperialism, things like that. So we're trying to bring a more of a race analysis to that. So again, our our focus here is to focus on globalization of higher education, the debates around that, specifically how whiteness shapes symmetries and futurity orientation. We don't want to, we're not suggesting race and racism similarly across the world. It varies, but also it's something interesting is that despite its variations, whiteness is also able to thrive within variant global terrains. And how is that possible? How does whiteness shape conceptions of pathways forward, including what is possible for a future self? And that's what we want to kind of grapple with in this paper. And particularly what we're focused on and what we mean by whiteness is this narrative, set of narrative structural positions, rhetorical tropes, and habits of perceptions that stands for what is considered to be the normal, i.e. the way to go. In other words, whiteness as a state of knowing and being privileges white people, institutions, and cultural norms, and more importantly, orients social and political environments towards the benefit and protection of white life. And here we're particularly drawing on Sarah Ahmed's work, Baldwin's work, I forget his name, James Baldwin, and others, okay?
Alex Baldwin.
And basically, sorry?
I think it's Alex Baldwin. James Baldwin is
someone else, sorry.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's what happens with a lot of Baldwins.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Kirsten. So basically the argument we're trying to make in this paper is that whiteness as futurity colonizes, but what we mean, orients global subjects. And by subjects, we're referring to nation states, policymakers, institutions, and individuals, imaginaries, and reinforces the asymmetrical movements, networks, and untethered economies underpinning global higher education. And basically, while this argument could be applied to many kinds of examples, here in this paper, we're focusing on two contemporary trends in global higher education. One is the global diffusion of liberal education, and the second is the growing global university rankings. And I'm going to now pass it on to my colleague.
Thank you.
And Kirsten, just let me know when you want me to push the next slide.
I will, thank you. Okay, so before we started, or as we began the project, we wanted to set a framework, because what we're trying to do here is we're bringing together, theoretically and conceptually, we're bringing together two primary fields of thought. So we're thinking about how critical whiteness studies informs temporal studies. And so we drew on a certain set of, a particular set of scholars who kind of work in and around these two big ideas. So as Riyad mentioned earlier, Baldwin's work on time and whiteness was useful for this project. Ahmed, of course. We also drew on Michelle Christensen, and Charles Mills' work on chronopolitics, and Christian's work on malleable whiteness. And through these four conceptual offerings, for lack of a better word, are these four authors in their ideas around critical whiteness and time and race, we were able to think about a frame that would help guide an exploration of how whiteness utilizes the globalization of higher education to recenter itself and reorient itself at the center globally. And so there are three ways in which whiteness is futurized or becomes temporal in the future. And that is, whiteness works as a producer and foreclosure of aspirations. And so we're thinking about Ahmed's idea about how whiteness orients us towards certain bodies, and how whiteness puts certain things in reach, or puts resources in reach. And so we want to think about how maybe how whiteness is putting the future in reach for some, and how it makes it seem, or how people can access the future through frames of whiteness. And then if whiteness is shaping these aspirations, or before I move on, how Baldwin talks about racial social imaginaries, as well as Mills talks about chronopolitics. So how race and whiteness is shaping what people imagine for their future, what people aspire to in the future, and how that is facilitated around racialized hierarchies. And then, so for an example, before I move forward, to think about how the Comprehensive Research Institution, as an example, how the Comprehensive Research Institution, which was really a product of white nations or white national educational systems, how that's been diffused as the global ideal. The Comprehensive Research Institution becomes the global ideal. So other nations globally begin to aspire towards that model of education. And so if there are particular aspirations that are formed by and shaped by whiteness, then there's also an expectation that people will, nations, global subjects will invest in acquiring those aspirations or attaining or reaching those aspirations that are shaped by whiteness. And so we're thinking about here how Baldwin's work on anticipatory logics helps us think about how anticipatory logics shape again, what people are aspiring to, and then also how those aspirations or how those logics are informed by desires for security. So investing in certain processes, investing in certain models that are informed by whiteness is seen as a process of prevention and seen as a process of precaution that informs a future security or future secured self. And so an example of that might be, we've seen in the literature that sometimes students in African contexts or African nations may, particularly in the STEM areas, may be resistant to the Africanization or indigenization of their curricula, because they recognize that in order to secure their economic futures, they need to be well versed in white models of education and white approaches to these ideas. And so they don't want to, they feel resistant to approaching the project from an Africanized perspective, because that might limit their ability to access the white ideal that will inform a secure future. And then also whiteness is malleable, and Riyad touched on this earlier about how whiteness is able to make itself seem accessible, make itself seem as if these resources are available to all by being malleable and responding to local contexts. So the way whiteness shows up in one context may not be the same way it shows up in another context. And Kirsten helps us think about this. She uses the term whiteness cis, or shape-shifting whiteness, or malleable whiteness, to think about how whiteness informs itself, shapes itself in local contexts, is to always appear accessible, but at the same time reasserting itself at the center. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is just a quick chart that our graph image, that's the word, that Kirsten has provided us to think about whiteness globally and to think about what it is that we mean when we say a nation is white. So we might be using Anglo-American or white nation as we move forward to underscore where these models and ideas are coming from. And so when we say white nation, as Kirsten notes here, whiteness is really centered around certain kind of national contexts. So United States at the top, United Kingdom, Western Europe, and Australia, and those national identities pretty significantly inform what is understood as white globally. And I'll leave that there and we can move forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so as mentioned earlier, we drew on two examples of globalization of higher education. One was liberal education, or the expansion of liberal education globally, and how that expansion is really informing a white future. So for instance, one of the ways in which liberal education informs a white future is liberal education gets attached to aspirations towards being a global subject. And that global subjectivity is primarily oriented towards whiteness. The next way, so as I mentioned earlier, the comprehensive research institution. So one of the fundamental principles of the comprehensive research institution is particularly the model in the West is the liberal education model. And so liberal education begins to stand in for, so access to a liberal education begins to stand in for as an indicator of someone's access to white models of education. And so that ends up informing a global subjectivity. Liberal education has also emerged as an important or significant preparatory educational model for the impending fourth industrial revolution. So there's all of this literature on how we're moving into the fourth industrial revolution. We're leaving the third industrial revolution. And liberal education in the fourth industrial revolution is informed by cyber metrics and networks and the significance of the internet, and also the significance of global communication in a cosmopolitan world. And all of these indicators of the fourth industrial revolution, to be prepared for that, gets attached to the liberal education model. So if you are a student of the liberal education model, if you're informed by or you have access to the liberal education, then you will be prepared for this impending fourth industrial revolution. And really, it attaches this kind of white-centric educational model to participation in the global marketplace, or preparation for participation in this transforming global marketplace. There's also a way in which liberal education gets made synonymous with democratic values, and also this projection of democratic values into the future, or these assumptions about democratic values that are very much informed by white nations. And so what happens is there is through this attachment between these assumptions about democratic values and liberal education, what is produced is re-entrenched is global racial presumptions and racialized hierarchies, because the assumption is that the only way to access the values that come from a democracy are through these white models of education. And so it just re-entrenches these racial presumptions about whiteness at the top and whiteness at the center, and racialized hierarchies. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and so liberal education, the emergence of liberal education globally also reproduces the kinds of classist social arrangements that are endemic to white nations, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. So what often happens is the universities that are able to provide these liberal education curriculums, or curricula, the universities globally that are able to provide liberal education curricula are often elite private institutions. So the only students globally who will have access to the liberal education model, this model that's supposed to produce the global subject and that's supposed to help students obtain their global aspirations, is only available in private institutions. So that means that the students who are going to access it are the students who are already well-resourced in those contexts, which furthers the divide between those who have and those who do not have. And so this reproduction of liberal education curricula in private schooling, again, re-entrenches or reproduces classes, social arrangements, and doesn't actually give or produce its commitment to democratizing agenda. It does, it actually reproduces classism instead of following through with this democratic values idea, our democratizing idea. As mentioned earlier, liberal education is also a malleable product. So in many contexts, people don't really have a very clear or determined or structured idea about what liberal education is. It gets to kind of float malleably and shape-shifting in a way that really it's just about the name liberal education, but it doesn't have to adhere to any kinds of particular principles as it moves globally. And what this does is it allows liberal education the idea to emerge in a lot of contexts and still accommodate misaligned value systems, which ends up neutralizing dissent and appearing accessible. So we see this. So one example of this is the way in which the liberal education curriculum at Yonsei University in South Korea emerges. So some authors have suggested that while there is the title of liberal education, this whole campus on liberal education, it's very bureaucratic. It very much doesn't respond to what the way it gets articulated in the broader university context is not reflective of what many would think of as a liberal education, as expansive, as non-hierarchical, as cosmopolitan in all of these different ways. It actually is just in name only, and it doesn't produce the kinds of it doesn't emerge as this kind of opportunity for free thinking in that context, but it becomes a nice, malleable product for the global subject. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the reproduction of liberal education globally also produces an investment in English language, in English language learning. So not only do universities want to provide a liberal education curriculum model, but they're also very much invested in that model being taught in English. And so what that does is it provides a context in which English-speaking teachers who are trained in white nations are a hot commodity globally. And it re-entrenches English at the center, re-entrenches white nations at the center, and it also protects white futures. So if you are the white subject within the white nation with the white access to the language that's associated with whiteness, then you are the global commodity that's whose professional future is protected. And then lastly, there's no real, the model emerges in these contexts less about the merit of liberal education and all of these values that are assumed to be produced therein, and it's more so an investment in neoliberal economies. So once you strip away all of the propagandized the rhetoric around having a liberal education curriculum or adopting a liberal education curriculum, what we really see is that nations globally just want want the product of liberal education or desire the product of liberal education for the purposes of participating in a neoliberal economy. And that neoliberal economy is very much controlled by white nations. And so the white nations and white controls and white products still, white agendas still, national agendas still remain at the center, even if there's misalignment across frames. Yes. And that's, next slide.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Kirsten. So another example whereby we want to discuss the ways in which whiteness as aspirations, as an investment and malleability reproduces itself is through the growing use of global university rankings. And the kind of argument we're trying to make is to become a global subject is to become white. And that's because what we want to show in this part of our paper is that global university rankings has become the orientation, is oriented around and towards white bodies. And what do we mean by that? The idea of global university rankings being oriented around and towards white bodies. And that's what we want to unpack here. So first of all, I'm not sure how many people are aware, but global university rankings are actually, has its historical roots in white US America. So the first university ranking was actually produced in 1921. This is just a university ranking. And this was by a psychologist. His name was James Cattell, who was a male psychologist. And his quest was to reproduce eminent white men. And this notion of, you know, wanting to reproduce eminent white men is part of a larger history of, you know, the science of statistics, which was at that time really developing in order to counter the decline of the great men. And so what Cattell was trying to do was, based on eugenic theoretical and methodological considerations, his first focus was mostly on individuals, but then it shifted towards institutions where eminent men could be reproduced. So his idea first was moving from the notion of eugenics, which is more about heredity and upbringing, but then shifted towards where would these kinds of men be produced? And so if you look on your top right corner here, this was the first ranking where Harvard was on the top. And again, the idea here was looking at those institutions, and by eminent men, they were looking at people with science, basically, the scientific strength. So what institutions would be the emblem of scientific and intellectual strength? So that's where the first ranking of universities really derives from, is this notion of really trying to ensure white futurity, i.e. more eminent white men in society, by identifying key higher education institutions that would promote the latter. And now, like, you know, 2003, we see the first global university ranking, and many of you probably are familiar with that, which, as some of you know, as Shanghai University rankings, but the more formal term is Academic Ranking of World Universities, ARWU. And again, the history with that was that it was used to, it was by some Shahjahan University researchers who were given the mandate to basically study and improve the relative position of Chinese universities. Particularly, first it started with just trying to compare Shahjahan with other Chinese, but how do you compare that without a set of metrics? So what these researchers did was their orientation towards what was considered to be excellent universities was the US-based comprehensive research institution, thereby promoting the Anglo-American model as its future self of Chinese higher education. And this is where Sarah Ahmed's work has been super helpful for us in terms of thinking of whiteness as orientation, because Ahmed reminds us that orientations are about how we begin and how we proceed from here. In other words, the Chinese began and proceeded with Anglo-American models. As such, whiteness as an orientation puts the university excellence in reach for the Chinese, thus defining their capacity to envision and aspire towards academic excellence. And wherever ARWU is transmitted around the world, and it's been used now all over the world, that's how whiteness continues as that emblem of excellence. Also, Another way of understanding how whiteness as an orientation is reproduced, according to Sarah Ahmed, is that whiteness informed space can be discerned by the repetition of passing by of some bodies, of some bodies and not others. So in other words, it raises the question, who or which bodies succeed in such rankings? And this is where a lot of work recently, but more recently, I would uh, um, bring attention to Michelle Steck's work, where she's published this wonderful piece in Policy Reviews in Higher Education, where she makes the argument that the big three university rankings, i.e. ARW, the Shahjahan rankings, Times Higher Education, QS, are basically all, no matter what their criteria is, they tend to reproduce the same 10 universities as the top 10. And these top 10 big three universities come from two regions of the world, Southern England and the USA. And when it comes to USA, it's basically mostly in the East Coast and West Coast, and some in the Midwest, like the University of Chicago. But overall, no matter what the criteria, they tend to reproduce the same kinds of bodies as being comfortable, or the ones that always are part of the top 10. So in other words, they privilege white metropolitan centers of knowledge. And these same, the regions in which they're, i.e. California, East Coast, tend to be also close to places that tend to be very close to media centers, like New York and others. So there's some correlations between where the media is and the ways in which these reputations get circulated around the world. But more interestingly, in the East Coast, those universities that we're talking about, like Harvard, Princeton, and so forth, also have histories and roots with the slave plantation economy around the world. And this is where Chris Wilder's work is important. So in other words, this whole thing about who succeeds in rankings have histories in white histories and in white bodies and white cultural norms and white institutions. Now, while certain, sorry, I need to click the next slide. While certain bodies, i.e. scholars, higher education institutions, governments, and cities, and one thing I forgot to mention that Michelle Steck does in her work is she highlights in looking at these top 10, their websites, and who do they advertise, or who do they privilege in their websites, and they tend to be about Nobel Prize winners and big eminent scientists. Again, who are those eminent scientists? They tend to be all white men. And you only get to the stuff on diversity and inclusion when you click more into these university websites. But the argument she's making that is, if you look at the clientele, I mean, not just what's represented in these top 10 institutions, but the boards of the actual corporate boards of these ranking bodies like Times Higher Education, ARW, and QS, you again see a similar reproduction of white men. Okay. All right. So now, while certain bodies like scholars, higher education institutions, governments, and cities occupy such global spaces of equivalence in comfort, other bodies, according to Ahmed, become visible when they do not pass, which means they stand out and stand apart. And this is what creates this notion of kind of shame and pride in being in such kinds of spaces. So then what happens is whiteness, as futurity, colonizes national and institutional actors' future aspirations and reinforces investments in whiteness as they play catch up in GERs and claim to be world class. So, Sarah Ahmed reminds us that performance, in other words, this idea of preparing oneself, precaution, preparedness, a performance is also an orientation towards the future, insofar as the action is also the expression of a wish or an intention. As such, local subjects, fearing the yet to come, or hoping for better things to come, start to then increasingly turn into global subjects by adopting a global white eye. So in other words, we're seeing more and more now national actors playing catch up in global university rankings and claiming to be world class. And they do this in a number of examples, such as mergers that you see, for instance, in France, internationalization efforts, efforts is spelled wrong, but internationalization efforts that you see in particularly East Asia, such as Korea, Japan, China. funding initiatives, Japan, creating hubs like Singapore, Middle East, whereby you have partnerships and with foreign institutions in order to look and create a hub of world-class higher education centers in the city itself. Another way in which we see this investment in whiteness is institutions, higher education institutions, as institutions increasingly turn or are considered global subjects. In other words, with global university rankings, as the way that, especially the big three, the way they measure rankings is about how well you perform so-called globally. And in doing so, as many institutions align themselves with trying to improve their rankings in such institutions, they start to negate local missions and autonomy as they turn to become global subjects. And as I said, based on its white historical and geopolitics of knowledge, this is the way in which whiteness then gets reproduced as institutions aspire and invest in a particular success defined by whiteness. Also, whiteness as futurity is reinforced as nation states and institutions invest in internationalization efforts, such as the recruitment of academic stars, international collaboration efforts, and English coursework. So for instance, one example of that is recently, or not recently, but much later, in 2008, for instance, no Saudi universities were included in the global ranking list. But then in King Saud University studied the experience of 98 international and prestigious universities in 10 advanced countries and created a strategic plan to raise King's KSU status among the world universities. In 6 months, KSU was able to form 79 program partnerships with world universities, include Harvard and Illinois, and recruit 14 Nobel Prize winners and highly recognized researchers. That's one example. Another example is what we see in Korean University and Seoul National University, who've also had to internationalize or corporatize their institutions in order, again, align with the government to get funding to become global leaders. So increasingly, governments are investing in institutions to become global leaders, but then those global leaders, the parameters of what global is defined by whiteness, okay? Another example of this is increasingly I'm doing work right now on global university rankings in the context of India. And this is just an example of how not whiteness, but more importantly, the notion of success or global success is defined by futurity. And this is a response by Times Higher Education spokesperson to India's performance in global university rankings in 2019. She says, India has a huge amount of potential in global higher education. The Indian government has strong ambitions to boost the global standing of its top universities and attract foreign students, academics, and research collaboration. It now needs to back up these aspirations with high levels of investment or risk declining further amid increasing global competition, especially from other parts of Asia. So from this narrative, you see that there is a forced future-oriented discourse of potential, ambitions, aspirations, investment, or risk is used to colonize the global future imaginary of higher education, thus reinvigorating whiteness in the global arena. Another way in which whiteness as futurity is reproduced, or we see it, is how whiteness becomes the grammar of success, particularly in institutional branding efforts. This was a recent study done by Bai et al., who looked at 4 universities and their websites in Korea and China, who are all aspiring to be world-class university. And what they noticed in their analysis of these websites is that oftentimes when they're talking about internationalization, they tend to, again, feature white-skinned bodies, either as scholars or as students. So while on one hand, you could say that this kind of websites are all about representing the present, they're more importantly about aspirations. They're more importantly about aspirations of what it would be like, what the world ought to be like in their institutions. And again, whiteness tends to be the predominant image that you see when it comes to being world-class, but particularly being world-class in terms of internationalization. Similarly, in our work with one of my colleagues, Annabelle Estera, we did a visual studies analysis of global university ranking websites, where we also argue that it normalizes white bodies as the default student. So again, whiteness becomes this means of defining what is normal, what is ideal, how the world ought to be in many of the branding efforts that you see, particularly for those who are trying to go up in their global university rankings, okay? So with that, we just have a couple of concluding remarks, and then we'll open up to Q&A. One is to start to unpack globalization of higher education as a technology of race and temporality, and that these two cannot be separated. That futurity orientations act like a mirror that reflects what the optimum future looks like, thus governing our present, in other words, in terms of preparedness, anticipatory logics, and so forth. That critical whiteness studies also helps us to think about the question of affect and visibility, particularly with the movement of ideas and templates across borders, why certain curricular templates or metrics stick like Velcro in certain places and not others. Also, affect studies helps us to view global actors as bodies who affect and are affected by various objects, such as rankings, global economy, or curriculum. Also, I think we suggest considering transnational racialization processes underpinning policies and practices in higher education that have so-called global faces, such as branding and mediatization of higher education. Furthermore, individuals in the global north need to interrogate their global privileges, even if they aren't white. And finally, consider the ultimate orientation governing the production of hybrids, given the malleable nature of whiteness. So with that, I think we are done with the presentation part. And now we can open it up for Q&A. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing, and then we can see each other. Okay, so it says here, if the future is plural, it makes sense for whiteness as property to be pluralized as well. Ah, okay. What do you think of that, Kirsten?
I was thinking through that, and I would like, maybe Sheila could, I have some opinions, but I'm not sure I'm understanding Sheila's statement completely. So before I respond, I would, if Sheila might elaborate, is she still here? Might elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that?
Thank you for, I'm having connectivity issues, so I'm just doing the audio. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, in the sense that, in order to democratize futures and Foresight's thinking, it needs to be conceptualized as full spectrum and plural. And I was reflecting on, first of all, thank you both for, this is very interesting. Thank you for sharing your work. Was reflecting on how by pluralizing it, is this not an opportunity to acknowledge that each cultural context, you were addressing the cultural and contextual specificity, excuse me, of this, as, does that help?
Oh, well, I'm gonna make a statement and then you tell me if it responds. So if it, you let me know if I'm understanding correctly. So I think this is what I think that the scholarship or the writing is trying to help, what I think that this paper is trying to help us think through, is that there is this presumption in the global that the global will be cosmopolitan and plural and democratizing. But what we notice in the globalization of higher education and globalization metrics broadly is that aim towards pluralization or the plural, or they aim towards cosmopolitanism or democratization is actually serves as a facade that really brings people back to whiteness. So whiteness still, because it gets unified around whiteness and the privileging of white subjects. So white people, white nations, white models. And so it appears, so even in the malleability of it in local contexts, so whiteness will shift to respond to those local contexts. Are like the tools of whiteness that are useful in one context are not as useful in another context, particularly because of maybe local resentment or resistance or local dissent or our local context in general. It just is not analogous. There's still a way in which it doesn't produce a democratizing, the malleability doesn't actually produce a plural, democratizing, cosmopolitan outcome, but actually instead just shapeshifts itself to reorient towards a white condition or a white model. Does that make sense? Or maybe, is that responsive to what you are suggesting?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes.
Okay. Oh, Aaron. Hi, Aaron. Would you mind sharing your last slide again? It would be helpful in processing the information. Okay, I'll try doing this, but I'm concerned that I might lose seeing people. I'm not very good at navigating both at the same time. So if people have questions, please speak up. But I'll put this last slide back again.
Could I go?
Sure.
Yes, Blanca.
Thank you so much, Kirsten and Riyad, for a fantastic presentation. It's very thought-provoking, and it's in some ways it's things that what I really appreciate about the work you're doing is that even though these are things that I have thought about, you know, in terms of globalization, neo-imperialism, colonialism, but naming it as the pursuit of whiteness is really putting the, you know, your thumb on the sore, right? Because it's not, we can talk about systems and economies and stuff, but at the end of the day, what you're making explicit is how entrenched this is in the history of oppression, of dispossession, of, you know, of bodies that look different than the dominant colonizer. And so it's just giving me a lot to rethink, just in terms of how you understand the world. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, you touched on the role of English as a medium of instruction in this, the performance of liberal studies. And I was wondering also about the role of organizations like the British Council in selling that ideal, you know, because I've always been curious about this. In, for example, this, when I learned English, let's